Today is sponsored by the St. Paul's Foundation, whose mission is to support, preserve, maintain the historic buildings and properties of St. Paul's. And they have been incredible partners over the years. The church is in the best shape I think it has ever been since it was built. And so I'm grateful for all of the work that has gone in by so many people, particularly the St. Paul's Foundation. And I would be remiss if not thanking those of you who are on the Covenant Circle, those who have remembered St. Paul's in your state plans. If you haven't done that, I encourage you to prayerfully consider it and become a member of the Covenant Circle. That's how the foundation grows and is able to do its great work. In the coming year, the St. Paul's Foundation is going to focus on our 1809 cemetery. So I've invited Andrew Blair, who is the managing trustee, a volunteer position that takes up a lot of time. But I've asked him to come and just give us a little teaser about what we can look for in the year to come in terms of a strategic plan. And let's thank Andrew on his way up here, please, for his hard work.
Thank you, Warren. My children told me I was good at teasing. So glad you all are here with an interest in cemeteries and our cemetery. I love our speaker's title, which is Cemeteries Are for the Living, Not Just the Dead. And I think that's what we're trying to create in this plan that we're working on. So first, if you've not made the trip to the cemetery, please do. Not speaking for myself, but for some volunteers who were there from the church, the Beefeaters, a couple of weeks ago. It's beautiful right now. Leaves are changing. It is a living spot. And what we are trying to do with this strategic plan is make it a good place for the living by preserving it, taking care of some drainage problems, repairing historical stones, but then also creating a place for final resting places, which is a new columbarium. So you will hear much more about it. The only call to action I have right now is to thank John Cole, who is helping us with the architecture of all this that we're thinking about, and to say, if you think in time you would be interested in a place in our columbarium, shoot me an email. I'm keeping a list. We'll be back in touch when it's time to talk about that, i.e. we know a little bit more about cost. But there's a place for the living there. It's a wonderful place to spend a couple hours calming down, and we'll think about the other when we have to think about it. But thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. I give thanks to John Siegel. Lizzie is here, so you'll let him know that he was mentioned today, who is the president of our foundation, who came up with the idea for this Latrobe lecture this year. Our lectureship is named for our architectural treasure and the architect who designed it for us. But as we look ahead to the cemetery, John Siegel said, we really should get someone who knows something about cemeteries. And so how I found John O. Peters, it was very high-tech and very low-tech. Very high-tech, 2 clicks on the internet goes directly to this man. And so when I found out that he was an attorney and lived in Richmond, I picked up the phone, very old-fashioned, and called Penny Saffer. Penny, who knows everyone and everybody. And I said, Penny, do you know John O. Peters? And she said, oh, we had dinner with him 2 nights ago. So, John Peters, glad that you're here. Welcome to St. Paul's. Let's join in welcome.
Here today to talk about cemeteries, but I'm not sure about you all. I'm not sure how many of you woke up this morning and said, I'm going down to St. Paul's to listen to some guy talk about cemeteries. But anyway, you're going to have to bear with me, and I hope to convince you that talking about cemeteries and visiting cemeteries is a very good thing. Now, we're here today to honor the great American architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe. And I ought to pay him tribute a little bit by acknowledging that he's America's first professional architect. He was the designer of the second United States Capitol after it was destroyed during the World War of 1812. had a significant impact on Virginia, but this is one of the few remaining works of his that continue to exist in our Commonwealth. And he was the designer of this marvelous church building next door. This is a very exciting time for your parish as well, because you're working on this strategic plan that you just heard about. But primarily, I'm here today to talk about the rural cemetery movement. And it was an immensely important social, cultural, religious, and artistic movement that was about much more than cemeteries. Keep that in mind. It's about much more than cemeteries. Some say that it introduced the Western world to a new way of death. And it also inspired America's cities to create their own green spaces within the cities. Rural cemeteries preceded public parks in the United States. I will tell you why I believe cemeteries are very important places by reading from the introduction to my book on Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. And this is a quote. "Each time I write about cemeteries, I become increasingly aware of the important role they play in the lives of the living. It is not easy for many people to see cemeteries in a positive light. To them, cemeteries will always be associated with a sense of loss, grief, and remorse. These people often see cemeteries as dark and brooding places, filled only with cold and bitter memories. All of us visit cemeteries to mourn, reflect, and remember. In them, we hear voices that no longer speak and echoes that reverberate with meaning, reminding us of enduring relationships and cherished moments. For those willing to take a broader view, it becomes possible to see that cemeteries can inject energy into our culture and give meaning to our values. Cemeteries can be vibrant and exciting places which affirm life and give birth to hope." Now, although Jefferson Davis and thousands upon thousands of Confederate dead are buried at Hollywood, that is not the primary reason it is important. Hollywood would be very important without the Civil War, because it is one of America's great rural cemeteries. Now, you figured out by now that I'm from out of town. And for some of you, even worse, I'm from Richmond. So I'm going to have to engage in some sort of cheap and cheesy effort to win you over, to evoke some sympathy, I guess. And it's really because of my topic. It's not the dark and brooding stuff about cemeteries. That's not it. It's because when you write about cemeteries, so much of the writer's toolbox is off limits. There are some of those handy-dandy words and phrases that writers always use that you just can't use when you're talking about cemeteries. Let me give you a few examples. You can't write about a grave situation, a body of evidence, a bold undertaking, a funereal atmosphere. I can't tell you that something as silent as a tomb, and heaven forbid using the currently very popular dead on arrival. Now, many people identify rural cemeteries with what they call garden cemeteries. There's nothing wrong with that. I just happen to believe that rural cemetery is the preferred description because I think it's more accurate. Not all rural cemeteries could be described as garden cemeteries. Your St. Paul Cemetery bears an interesting relationship to the movement and I shall talk more about that later. Now, let's talk about the fundamentals of the rural cemetery movement. As I've said, it's about much more than cemeteries. The first thing is that cemeteries are for the living as well as the dead, and that they ultimately became sites for family gatherings, picnics, and tourists. Now, this will seem like a diversion to you at the outset, but it's not. It's the key to this whole thing. It occurred during the heart of the Romantic period, which extended from around 1800 to a peak in 1850. It's reflected in almost every aspect of our culture: painting, literature, music. All of those topics became preoccupied with nature during the Romantic period. The manifestations were emotional and often nationalistic. We have only to recall the English Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Byron, Keats. You remember those classes you probably disliked in college, dealt with them. And you have the Hudson River School of Painters in the United States at the time, those evocative landscapes that they painted on large canvases. Or you have Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, the Pastoral Symphony, which the composer described as a study of country life. Now, the Romantic period was inspired by the Industrial Revolution. People were leaving their farms and their small communities. They were moving to cities. They were working in factories. Mass production was coming into being, and people feared that they were losing touch with nature. And they were disturbed that they might, along with that, be losing touch with values they held dear. So this was the pervasive atmosphere at the time the rural cemetery movement took place. Now, the roots of the rural cemetery movement itself can be traced to 18th century English gardens, where the emphasis was on melancholy contemplation, which was or has been defined as pleasure drawn from subtle sadness cultivated in a naturalistic setting. Excuse me. Now, rural cemeteries were the forerunners of public parks in America. Greenwood Cemetery in Richmond, another famous rural cemetery, it's in Brooklyn, was opened in 1838, well before nearby Prospect Park. When Central Park was opened in New York in 1869, the art critic for the New York Times this is 1869, referring to the rural cemeteries, wrote, and this is a quote: "People were glad to get fresh air and a sight of grass and trees and flowers with, now and then, a pretty piece of sculpture, to say nothing of the drive to all that beauty and back again, without considering too deeply whether it might not be better to have it all without the graves and funeral processions." Thank goodness they concluded that it would be better to have it without the graves and funeral processions. But so that first comes the rural cemetery movement, then comes green space in our cities. Now, I'm going to start showing you some rural cemeteries. First one I'm going to show you is Père Lachaise in Paris, which was the world's first rural cemetery. These are tourist photographs that I took on a visit to Paris. This is the entrance to Père Lachaise. It was opened in 1804, early in the Napoleonic era. It was the focus of worldwide publicity. I'm not exaggerating here. It was the focus of worldwide publicity. And it was then and remains today a major tourist attraction. Paris prohibited burials in the city. Decaying bodies were becoming dangerous to public health. I'm going to tell you to note the monumentality of the entrance. Something else is going on here beside a place to bury the dead. This is not the entrance to a place only to place dead bodies. If you notice the round architectural features on both sides of the entrance, there's a tip-off here. There are torches on both sides of those circles. Now, traditionally in cemeteries, torches are inverted. They represent life extinguished. These torches are not inverted. They are straight up in full flame. That tells you something. It tells you they were willing to talk as much about the living as the dead. Intrinsic to the movement in France was the commemoration of heroes. Post-revolutionary France was a country struggling to repair its fractured culture. I have limited pictures of Père Lachaise. Could write a book about it, and many have. Paved walkways, quite a rugged site in many ways. Some pretty substantial tombs and mausoleums. Now I'm going to introduce you to a phrase that the writers about rural cemeteries simply love. They like to refer to naked rows of graves. Now, there were no naked rows of graves at Père Lachaise, like you would find in your typical municipal cemetery or your typical churchyard, graveyard. To make Père Lachaise more appealing, they moved some famous people there. They moved France's two most famous lovers, Abelard and Eloise, and reinterred them there. They reside there today. With Balzac, Daumier, Chopin, Edith Piaf, Sarah Bernhardt, and to many, and most important of all, to many Americans of a certain age, Jim Morrison. Obviously, that's probably a connection. If you've heard of Père Lachaise, it's probably in that connection, because the lead vocalist for The Doors died in Paris in 1971, I think at age 27, and is buried in Père Lachaise. So every time I mention Père Lachaise when I talk about rural cemeteries, I always get a reaction when I say Jim Morrison. and it's always happens. Now, we're going to change cemeteries now. We're going to come across the Atlantic, and we're going to visit Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston. Now, it was founded 27 years after Père Lachaise and is the first rural cemetery in the United States. It's located 3 to 4 miles outside Boston on the banks of the Charles River. It was America's first rural cemetery. American writers were instrumental in bringing the movement across the Atlantic. Washington Irving thought that American culture could be improved by that, and I'm quoting, rich vein of melancholy in English character, unquote. He believed that cemeteries should not only inspire veneration for the dead, but also, and I'm quoting, win the living to virtue, unquote. So Washington Irving thought there was a role for all of us, living or dead, to play in connection with cemeteries. Now, the driving force behind the founding of Mount Auburn was Dr. Joseph Bigelow, a medical professor at Harvard, who became very concerned, if not upset, about the health hazards created by overflowing cemeteries in the cities, or in the midst of Boston in particular. Now, the main architectural feature of Mount Auburn is this Egyptian Revival gatehouse that was designed by Bigelow. I will be saying much more about the Egyptian Revival. Mount Auburn was the subject of an astounding amount of public publicity nationally. Within a decade, rural cemeteries were founded in Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Brooklyn. All exalted the natural landscape with little formality. They became retreats from everyday life, and it was said provided the most graphic evidence of a new way of death. It was also said that during the Romantic period, death was transformed from something grotesque into something beautiful. The landscape design for Mount Auburn was by General Henry Dearborn, president of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. It was revolutionary, and it featured meandering roads and pathways, irregularly shaped lots and lakes, all with an emphasis on the pastoral. Among the people buried at Mount Auburn are Oliver Wendell Holmes, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Henry Cabot Lodge, and the famous architect Charles Bulfinch. For the first time, we begin to associate, we begin to see monumental works of art in cemeteries. Art for art's sake, not as monuments to mark the graves of the dead. It should come as no surprise that it is Egyptian. Egyptian architecture was a natural fit in a cemetery by reason of its obvious connotations about death and dying. Egyptian motifs, especially the obelisk, are popular throughout American cemeteries. In ancient Egypt, obelisks symbolized the sun god Ra. They represented rays of sunshine. They are immensely popular generally in this country, and it has been said that they are a naturalized citizen of the United States. They found their way here after passing through the Italian Renaissance and becoming classical motifs. We come now to the St. Paul's Cemetery, founded in 1809. Let's just review those dates. Père Lachaise, 1804. Mount Auburn, 1831. St. Paul's, 1809. St. Paul's is closer to Père Lachaise than it is to Mount Auburn. It was 27 years before the opening of America's first rural cemetery. Now, there's a clear reason why this occurred, and it was because of a very wise and far-thinking move by the town of Alexandria. At a date far earlier than any other community that I know of in the country, Alexandria passed legislation that prohibited the burial of dead bodies in the city. At that time, St. Paul's was located in a small building on Fairfax Street. It was before your current church building was constructed. It coincides almost precisely with Père Lachaise, but it bears none of the earmarks of a rural cemetery. It is an anomaly. Alexandria was then part of the District of Columbia, having been ceded to the District of Columbia. As part of the effort to establish the district, it was ceded. Now, the act was well ahead of its time. The reasons are even more interesting. It did it because the burial of dead bodies in the city was considered a nuisance. It was a danger to public health, and it said so in its legislation. Now, just by comparison, New York City did not prohibit the burial of dead bodies in the city until 1823. In other words, 19 years later than Alexandria. So, what do we have here? What does St. Paul's have here? We have a church cemetery that was established outside a town because burials had been prohibited as a danger to public health. Thus, it was, in essence, a churchyard cemetery, churchyard graveyard, without the church. Now, here's the evidence. This is a plot of the St. Paul's Cemetery. Straight roadways, uniform lots all in a row, laid out on the grid system. This is a photograph of the St. Paul's Cemetery, illustrating the uniformity of the lots, the level contours of the land, and those naked rows of graves. Now, I should emphasize here that there's absolutely nothing wrong with naked rows of graves. They exist in abundance throughout America. And they have been the commonplace graveyards or burial grounds of our people for centuries. Now, what we're looking here is we're looking at an evolution. In the latter part of the 20th century, we had memorial gardens where people thought that all grave markers ought to be flush with the ground. So that's the other extreme, the ultimate deprofessionalization of the burial.